The 1940s were haunted by shadows both real and imagined. In an era scarred by war, movie theaters became sanctuaries where fear could be safely explored on screen. But what if I told you that some of the most chilling horror films of that decade have been buried by time, forgotten by critics, ignored by studios, yet still powerful enough to unsettle us today? Number 15. The Devil Bat, 1940. At its release, The Devil Bat was considered a modest programmer, a quick fright vehicle starring the legendary Bela Lugosi. Audiences didn't expect greatness, just eerie entertainment, and they got more than they bargained for. The story followed a small town terrorized by a monstrous bat, enlarged through sinister experiments. Lugosi, playing the vengeful Dr. Carruthers, directed his mutated creation to attack those who had wronged him. What unnerved censors wasn't just the violence, but the underlying subtext, a scientist weaponizing nature to settle petty personal scores. In the shadow of wartime anxieties, the idea of ordinary citizens suddenly vulnerable to grotesque biological weapons struck an uncomfortably real chord. Some regional theater boards whispered that its themes cut too close to home, hinting at wartime sabotage, and briefly pulled the film. Behind the scenes, Lugosi struggled against typecasting. This was one of many low-budget horror assignments he reluctantly accepted after Hollywood refused to give him more prestigious roles. Critics dismissed the movie as drive-in filler, but audiences who saw it remembered its bizarre mix of gothic atmosphere and grotesque invention. Decades later, The Devil Bat resurfaced on late-night television, where its campy thrills and haunting premise drew a cult following. Number 14. The Undying Monster, 1942. Released quietly by 20th Century Fox, The Undying Monster was never meant to rival Universal's legendary monsters. Yet its moody atmosphere and blend of horror and mystery made it one of the decade's eeriest hidden gems. The story centered on a wealthy British family cursed by a supernatural beast that prowled the fog-laden moors, striking terror into anyone who crossed its path. On the surface, it was just another monster film. But underneath, audiences sensed something darker, a metaphor for inherited trauma, for family secrets that could not be buried. Wartime censors worried that its grim tone, with death hovering over a respectable household, might hit too close to real tragedies endured by countless families during World War II. Rumors swirled that Fox deliberately buried its marketing to avoid backlash. Production wasn't smooth either. Director John Brom clashed with studio executives who feared the picture was too morbid to succeed. Critics at the time were lukewarm, praising its shadowy cinematography but dismissing its plot as too grim for mainstream viewers. As a result, the film faded quickly from theaters, overshadowed by more prominent wartime dramas. And yet, for those who rediscovered it years later, The Undying Monster revealed itself as a work far ahead of its time. Number 13. King of the Zombies, 1941. When it premiered, King of the Zombies was brushed off by critics as another cheap horror programmer, produced quickly to fill double bills. Yet audiences who dared to watch found themselves facing something far stranger. The story followed three stranded men on a Caribbean island, where they discovered a sinister doctor performing experiments to control the living dead. What set it apart from other horror of its time was its uncomfortable blend of real-world anxieties and supernatural dread. Released during the height of World War II, its villain was revealed to be a spy working for Axis powers, using voodoo and hypnosis as weapons. Some censors worried the film made wartime espionage look fantastical, even mocking, and whispers circulated that certain boards wanted it suppressed for being in poor taste. Behind the camera, producer Monogram Pictures, famed for quick, low-budget thrillers, struggled to keep the production afloat. Sets were reused and costumes recycled from other films. Yet despite the limitations, the film carried an eerie atmosphere, made even more memorable by Mantan Moreland's comic relief performance, which today draws both criticism and historical curiosity. Audiences at the time laughed nervously, torn between terror and comedy. Over the years, King of the Zombies disappeared into obscurity, treated as disposable B-movie fodder. Number 12. The Leopard Man, 1943. At its release, The Leopard Man was marketed as a suspenseful thriller rather than outright horror, but audiences left theaters chilled to the bone. Directed by Jacques Tourneur, who had already stunned with cat people, the film told of a small town gripped by fear after a circus leopard escapes, and a series of gruesome murders follow. Was the beast guilty, or was something human lurking in the shadows? The film was daring in its use of suggestion. Tourneur avoided graphic violence, instead lingering on footsteps, doors closing, and screams echoing in the night. This subtlety made it even more terrifying, and censors were unsettled by the implications. Some regional boards tried to restrict screenings, arguing that the invisible violence preyed too cruelly on the imagination, especially in wartime audiences already shaken by real headlines. Behind the scenes, producer Val Lewton fought constant battles with RKO executives. Ordered to make horror films on shoestring budgets, Lewton turned necessity into art. With clever lighting, haunting music, and suggestion over spectacle, he created something critics later hailed as revolutionary. At the time, though, reviews were divided, some praising its atmosphere, others dismissing it as too bleak for entertainment. Number 11. Dead Men Walk, 1943. Produced by Tiny PRC Pictures, Dead Men Walk was initially dismissed as a Dracula imitation. Yet beneath its low-budget trappings lay one of the most atmospheric vampire tales of the decade. The plot followed twin brothers, one a respected doctor, the other a practitioner of dark arts. When the evil brother dies and rises as a vampire, the good brother must stop him, while townsfolk grow suspicious of both. Censors bristled at the film's imagery of desecration and occult rituals. At a time when the Hays Code tried to keep horror respectable, this little production pushed boundaries with its stark portrayal of vampirism as spiritual corruption. Whispers spread that some church groups lobbied to have it pulled from certain towns, fearing it promoted superstition. Behind the curtain, star George Zucco was juggling multiple horror roles, often typecast as sinister villains. Despite PRC's meager resources, Zucco gave the role a gravitas that elevated the picture far beyond its budget. Critics scoffed at its recycled sets and simplistic effects, but for audiences in small-town theaters, it was an unforgettable brush with gothic dread. Over time, Dead Men Walk all but vanished, overshadowed by Universal's horror juggernauts. Number 10. Isle of the Dead, 1945. At its release, Isle of the Dead was overshadowed by bigger wartime films, yet today it lingers as one of Val Lewton's most haunting works. The story follows a Greek general, played with quiet ferocity by Boris Karloff, who becomes trapped on a quarantined island during a plague outbreak. As death closes in, whispers of an ancient vampire-like spirit, the Vorvolaka, begin to spread among the survivors. Censors were unnerved by the film's parallels to real wartime horrors. The notion of quarantine, mass death, and unseen enemies mirrored the world's grim reality in 1945. Some critics argued it was too bleak, too suffocating, for audiences already living with rationing and casualty reports. Rumors swirled that RKO hesitated to promote it heavily, fearing it would repel war-weary moviegoers. Behind the scenes, production was troubled. Karloff's health was failing, forcing filming delays and rewrites to accommodate his condition. The result was a film stripped to its essence, claustrophobic, atmospheric, drenched in shadows. Audiences who did see it were struck by its oppressive mood, though box office numbers remained modest. Over time, however, Isle of the Dead has been recognized as a quiet masterpiece. Number 9. The Mad Monster, 1942. When The Mad Monster hit theaters, it was quickly dismissed as a cheap knockoff of Universal's werewolf cycle. Produced by PRC Pictures, it featured George Zucco as yet another mad scientist, injecting his assistant with wolf's blood to transform him into a murderous beast. At the time, critics called it formulaic, but audiences in small-town theaters still gasped at its savage premise. What made it controversial wasn't just the monster, but its subtext. Released in the midst of World War II, some read it as a dark allegory about men being turned into weapons against their will. The idea of manufactured monsters was an eerie reflection of wartime propaganda and experimentation rumors. Some regional boards even tried to restrict its screenings, fearing its brutal violence was inappropriate for younger audiences. Production troubles were typical of PRC: rushed filming schedules, threadbare sets, and little money for special effects. Yet these very limitations gave it a strange rawness, a stripped-down quality that made the transformation sequences, filmed mostly in shadows, eerily effective. Actor Glenn Strange, who would later become famous as Frankenstein's monster for Universal, gave the creature a hulking menace that elevated the film. Number 8. The Body Snatcher, 1945. When The Body Snatcher premiered, it was hailed as one of the most daring horror films of the 40s. Produced by Val Lewton for RKO and starring both Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi, it drew upon Robert Louis Stevenson's grim tale of grave robbing in 19th-century Edinburgh. Karloff delivered one of his most sinister performances as John Gray, a cabman who supplies corpses to a medical doctor, by any means necessary. The controversy was immediate. The Hays Code had long discouraged explicit references to grave robbery and murder for medical science, yet Lewton's film put these horrors front and center. Religious groups protested, arguing it glorified sacrilege. Some theaters hesitated to book it, wary of public backlash. For audiences, though, the film's shocking frankness was both disturbing and exhilarating. Behind the scenes, tension brewed. This would mark the last screen pairing of Karloff and Lugosi, two horror titans whose careers had diverged dramatically. Lugosi's role was small, reflecting his decline in Hollywood, while Karloff reveled in the complexity of his villainous character. The uneasy dynamic between them gave the film an added layer of poignancy. Though initially divisive, The Body Snatcher grew in stature over the years. Critics later praised its fearless confrontation with death, science, and morality. Number 7. Return of the Vampire, 1943. When Return of the Vampire arrived in theaters, it seemed like Columbia Pictures was shamelessly copying Universal's monster cycle, and in some ways they were. Bela Lugosi, forever associated with Count Dracula, donned the cape once more, but this time under the name Armand Tesla, a vampire awakened in wartime London. Audiences, already weary from bombings and blackouts, found themselves facing a horror that mirrored their daily fears. The controversy came swiftly. Wartime censors worried that using London as a backdrop for supernatural devastation might be seen as exploiting the real suffering of the Blitz. Some critics even accused Columbia of insensitivity, weaving fiction into very real destruction. Yet others found the blending of gothic horror with modern war settings chillingly effective, as if monsters had simply adapted to the new battlefield. Behind the scenes, Columbia walked a fine line. They wanted Lugosi's star power but couldn't legally use the name Dracula, owned by Universal. The workaround, Tesla, was a thin disguise, and insiders whispered that lawsuits loomed. Lugosi himself was reportedly frustrated by the budget restraints and by once again being typecast, yet his performance is commanding, melancholy, and terrifying all at once. The film vanished quickly after its run, overshadowed by bigger wartime releases. Number 6. Strangler of the Swamp, 1946. Released by Tiny PRC Pictures, Strangler of the Swamp was little more than a whisper in theaters. Audiences barely noticed it, yet those who did never forgot the fog-drenched atmosphere. The story unfolded in a remote swamp community haunted by the ghost of a lynched ferryman who returned from the grave to exact vengeance on those who wronged him. Censors bristled at the theme of vigilante justice from beyond the grave. Some argued it undermined faith in the law and glorified revenge. In conservative communities, whispers circulated that the film was too morbid for public exhibition, and screenings were pulled after minimal runs. The supernatural revenge plot, tied so directly to the failings of human justice, was simply too provocative. Behind the camera, director Frank Wisbar worked miracles with scraps. Reusing sets, draping heavy fog across scenes, and relying on eerie silence instead of costly effects, he created a suffocating, dreamlike atmosphere. Actor Charles Middleton, famous as Ming the Merciless, lent the vengeful ghost an unforgettable presence. Though critics dismissed the film as another Poverty Row curio, some praised its haunting mood. For decades, Strangler of the Swamp was nearly lost, screened only sporadically on late-night television, but modern reassessments hail it as one of the most atmospheric ghost stories of the 40s. Number 5. The Spiral Staircase, 1946. Unlike many forgotten horrors, The Spiral Staircase was no cheap programmer. Produced by RKO and directed by Robert Siodmak, it was a prestige thriller at its release. Yet time has buried it beneath bigger names. The film tells the story of a mute young woman trapped in a mansion, stalked by a serial killer preying on women with disabilities. Audiences in 1946 were riveted and disturbed. Its controversy stemmed from its subject matter. The idea of a murderer targeting women for their perceived imperfections was shockingly bold for its time. Some censors argued it bordered on sadistic. Others whispered that it challenged Hollywood's glossy portrayal of womanhood, presenting vulnerability and difference not as flaws but as survival. In several regions, protests briefly delayed its screenings. Behind the scenes, the production was demanding. Actress Dorothy McGuire, playing the mute heroine, carried much of the film without dialogue, relying on expression and body language. Siodmak, known for his mastery of film noir, drenched the mansion in shadows, creating an atmosphere that blurred the line between psychological suspense and horror. Critics praised it, yet over the decades it slipped from mainstream memory, eclipsed by later thrillers like Psycho. Rediscovered by scholars and horror enthusiasts, The Spiral Staircase is now celebrated as a milestone. Number 4. Cat People, 1942. At its release, Cat People was both a sensation and a puzzle. RKO expected little from this modest horror film, but audiences made it a surprise hit. Directed by Jacques Tourneur and produced by Val Lewton, the story followed Irina, a Serbian woman convinced she is cursed to transform into a panther if she surrenders to passion. Audiences in 1942 were mesmerized by its ambiguity. Censors were uncomfortable with its themes. Though nothing explicit was shown, its suggestion of primal urges and forbidden transformation pushed boundaries of what the Hays Code allowed. Some boards debated banning it altogether, whispering that it used horror as a metaphor for suppressed desire. Studio executives panicked, but Lewton, working with shadows and suggestion, knew that implication was far more powerful than spectacle. Behind the scenes, RKO slashed budgets, forcing Lewton and Tourneur to innovate. The result was groundbreaking, the first major use of the Lewton bus scare where sudden noise and movement created terror without a monster on screen. Critics were divided at the time. Some called it too subtle, others hailed it as genius. Number 3. The Seventh Victim, 1943. When The Seventh Victim premiered, it shocked audiences with its bleakness. Produced by Val Lewton, it told the story of a young woman searching for her missing sister in New York City, only to uncover a secret cult that worshipped death. Unlike most horror films of the time, it offered no happy ending. Instead, it closed with silence, despair, and the chilling suggestion of suicide. Censors battled with Lewton over its content. The suggestion of death as release, the portrayal of urban cults, and the oppressive tone pushed well beyond the boundaries of escapist entertainment. Some theaters refused to show it, citing its morbid influence. Critics at the time were unsettled. Many dismissed it as too grim for audiences enduring wartime hardship. Behind the camera, Lewton's battles with RKO were constant. Executives demanded a more conventional resolution, but Lewton resisted, leaving the ending ambiguous and haunting. Actress Jean Brooks, with her enigmatic performance, embodied the shadows of despair in ways critics later called unforgettable. Though forgotten by most mainstream audiences, The Seventh Victim has since been celebrated as one of the darkest films of the 1940s. Its influence can be seen in modern horror and psychological thrillers, from Roman Polanski to David Lynch. Number 2. I Walked with a Zombie, 1943. When I Walked with a Zombie was released, critics scoffed at its lurid title. Many dismissed it as nothing more than a cheap cash-in. But those who saw it discovered one of the most poetic horror films ever made. Once again, Val Lewton and Jacques Tourneur crafted a masterpiece, transposing Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre into a Caribbean setting steeped in voodoo, colonialism, and unspoken dread. The controversy was immediate. Its frank depiction of voodoo rituals and its subtext about colonial oppression made some audiences deeply uncomfortable. Censors in certain regions worried it portrayed primitive religion too vividly, while others whispered that it dared to equate European rationality with superstition. For a film meant as B-movie filler, it was dangerously intelligent. Behind the scenes, Luton fought executives who wanted more obvious scares. Instead, he insisted on mood, shadows, and haunting images. A zombie woman gliding silently through moonlit cane fields, ritual drums echoing in the night. At the time, audiences were divided, some bewildered, others entranced. Rediscovered decades later, I Walked with a Zombie is now considered one of the greatest horror films of the decade, even rivaling the prestige of Cat People. Number 1. The Wolfman, 1941. At the top of our list is the legend that time almost buried. The Wolfman, starring Lon Chaney Jr., was not an instant classic when it premiered in 1941. Though it performed decently at the box office, it was seen as another Universal monster entry, solid, but not revolutionary. Few realized it would become one of the most influential horror films in history. The premise was deceptively simple: an ordinary man bitten by a wolf, cursed to transform under the full moon. But beneath the gothic trappings was something raw and human, an allegory of guilt, repression, and uncontrollable urges. Censors worried about its brutality, with transformation scenes pushing the limits of what could be shown. Studio executives even considered toning it down, but ultimately gambled on the horror. Behind the scenes, Lon Chaney Jr. endured hours in the makeup chair, suffering from the groundbreaking but grueling effects work of Jack Pierce. Tensions flared as production fell behind schedule, yet the results were unforgettable. Critics at the time were mixed. Some praised its atmosphere, others dismissed it as formulaic. And yet, its legacy has only grown. The Wolfman established rules for werewolf lore still used today: silver bullets, full moons, and tragic curses. Forgotten by many in its own decade, it later became a cornerstone of horror history. Today, it still chills, not only with its snarling beast, but with its deeper truth that the most terrifying monsters are those we carry within. The 1940s may feel distant, but these forgotten horrors still breathe in the shadows. Each film carries the paranoia, trauma, and whispered fears of a world at war. And perhaps that's why they still chill us today. Which of these films do you think deserves a revival? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below.